In recent years, Western Canada has seen the resurgence of a small but impassioned political movement, proposing that the western half of Canada ought to separate from its eastern counterpart. This philosophy stems from the notion that the western provinces take an unfair backseat to the provinces of Ontario and Quebec in federal politics, and is underpinned by the century-old sentiment that Western and Eastern Canada are essentially distinct and separate nations. Politics and culture aside, anyone who has made the long drive between Western and Eastern Canada can attest to the fact that the historic metropolises of southern Ontario and the Laurentian Valley, and the mixed forests and lush farmland which surround them, are at least geographically separated from the Manitoba prairies that mark the eastern edge of Western Canada by a sprawling, sparsely populated tract of wilderness, bridged only by two narrow ribbons of railway and quiet two-lane asphalt. This rugged stretch of Canadian Shield is a natural borderland, having served in centuries past as the ill-defined no man's land separating Rupert's Land, the territory of the northerly British Hudson's Bay Company, from the Pays d'Ao, or upper country, of French Canada. In a manner reminiscent of medieval cartography, in which monsters populate the blank spaces of the map, legend has it that this remote frontier is haunted by a variety of strange and mysterious denizens. The local Ojibwa, Cree, and Ojibwa First Nations, whose ancestors have called the region home since time immemorial, have long maintained that their northern woods are the domain of a sinister entity called the Wendigo, or Witico, variously described as a gaunt preternatural giant with a craving for human flesh, or the spirit of that boreal demon, which imbues in the psyches of the vulnerable its own cannibalistic proclivities. Native legend contends that the lakes and rivers that crisscross the Canadian Shield, and particularly the rocky cliffs that fringe them, are home to little aquatic goblins, sometimes described as hairy dwarfs, and at other times characterized as long-haired sirens. The skies above this wild country are supposed to be frequented by a giant eagle with the ability to create thunder and lightning, while Lake Superior to the south is said to be patrolled by a colossal underwater lynx with preternatural power. Of all the legendary monsters said to haunt this vast and lonely wilderness, among the most obscure are the wild giants, supposed to be members of some large and ancient human tribe. In his 1995 book, Sacred Legends, Canadian folklorist James R. Stevens included several traditional Ojibwa giant stories told to him by elders of the Sandy Lake First Nation in northwestern Ontario. One of these tales is set on the shores of Deer Lake, a remote body of water about 60 kilometers or 37 miles southwest of the Sandy Lake Reserve. For many years, the story begins, the Indians on Deer Lake were plagued by a race of strange giant men. These monsters would come in the winter and would destroy their villages, killing and raping the Indians at will. Some of the braves would fight them when they came, but arrows had no effect on the giants. They could not be killed. After an especially devastating raid, the men of Deer Lake held a powwow in their medicine lodge, determined to resolve their untenable situation. One young warrior suggested that the band quit the country and flee to the west. His proposal was countered by a veteran brave, who spurned the idea of abandoning the homeland of his ancestors, and argued that the region to the west was occupied by hostile tribes who would give them as much trouble as the giants did. After some time, the oldest man in the tribe, an elder named Musquay, respected for his wisdom, who had hitherto sat in silence, smoking his pipe, declared that he had learned the secret of the giant's invulnerability in a dream the previous night. In his dream, he saw the village of the giants, which lay on a riverbank a 7 days' journey from their own camp. Within the village was a nest where the giants kept their own beating hearts, safe from the knives and arrows of their Indian enemies. "Destroy the hearts," Musquay said, "and we will be rid of the giants forever." Although most of the warriors dismissed Musquay's vision as a wishful nocturnal reverie, one fat boy stood up and declared that he would take it upon himself to find the village of which the elder had dreamed. Although his peers laughed him out of the medicine lodge, deriding him for his weak constitution and his lack of skill as a hunter, The fat boy resolutely retrieved his bow and arrows and headed into the wilderness on snowshoe, following Musque's directions. After 7 days of constant traveling, the fat boy espied a cluster of tall lodges standing atop a hill overlooking the river. At the edge of this camp was an elevated platform on which reposed a quantity of huge beating hearts, red, glistening, and steaming in the cold. The boy withdrew his bow and sent arrow after arrow into the living organs. When the arrows pierced the hearts, Stevens wrote, great moans and cries of agony came from around the camp. Everywhere, giants were dropping dead in their footsteps. Then a giant came running across the ground to the nest. He had understood why his brothers and sisters were dying. When he got to the top of the scaffold, an arrow from the fat boy found his heart, and he crumpled to the ground. The fat warrior shot arrows into all the hearts, killing the whole tribe of giants. Then he descended the platform and extinguished the campfires of the giants forever. There are 2 more giant stories in Stevens' book, each featuring a legendary hero and trickster figure called Jackabash, or Poke in the Eye. These stories indicate that the giants were more numerous in the ancient past, and that they enjoyed eating the natives whom they killed in battle. Giant legends also appear in American anthropologist Robert A. Brightman's 1989 book on the oral traditions of the Rock Cree of Granville Lake, Manitoba. Stories featuring a legendary hero called Kakapis, whom Brightman identifies as a swampy Cree variant of the Ojibwe Jackabash, describe a race of huge wild men called Mistapewak. The Mistapewak are portrayed as enormous men of immense strength, who travel alone or in pairs, abducting native women and hunting native men. In addition to the aforementioned Wendigo and cliff-dwelling mer-dwarfs, there are at least 2 more humanoid monsters whom native legend says once abode in the wilderness of the Canadian Shield. In their 1962 book, Ojibwe Myths and Legends, Sister Bernard Coleman, Ellen Frogner, and Estelle Ike describe a legendary figure they call the Wildman of the Woods. There is a man in buckskin who goes about the lakes and woods, they wrote, and then he is gone. Sometimes people hear a whistle, or they hear their names called, but the minute they turn around, the man of the wild woods is gone. Or a rack of tools might fall over, but no one is there. A few people say that they have seen him, and that sometimes he has smiled, but only for a second, and then he is gone. Some say he is a spirit who's trying to get himself back into human form. A 4th class of legendary human-like monster, said to have once prowled the forest north of the Great Lakes, is a race of primitive human, referred to collectively as the Hairy Hearts, or the Hairy Breasts. These wild and robust people are said to have once waged perpetual war against their Cree and Ojibwe neighbors, killing men and kidnapping women. They did not make use of the bow and arrow, but rather hunted their game and attacked their enemies by running them down, tackling them, and tearing them open with stone knives. Most versions of this ancient legend contend that native warriors wiped out these Stone Age predators long ago. Just as legendary wildmen do not appear to be especially important elements of Cree and Ojibwe oral tradition, modern sightings of hairy wildmen in the forests of northern Ontario are relatively scant. There is, however, one intriguing case which appears in classic Bigfoot literature, indicating that the old Cree and Ojibwe legends of wild giants, preternatural wildmen, and primitive humans might be more than fireside fairy tales. This case consists of 4 eerily consistent sightings, set in the same unassuming corner of civilization, the oldest of the 4 separated from the latest by a span of 64 years. In the heart of the desolate expanse of boreal forest and Precambrian rock, which separates eastern and western Canada, lies the tiny town of Cobalt, Ontario, the living relic of an early 20th century silver rush, for which it served as the hub. Back in 1903, following 2 silver strikes made by contractors engaged in the construction of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, Canadian and American prospectors began to trickle into the area, establishing the boomtown of Cobalt at the site of one of the original discoveries. By the outbreak of the Great War, when the stampede began to abate, the surrounding silver fields had yielded over 32 million ounces of raw argentic treasure. In September 1906, at the height of the Cobalt silver rush, a group of men tasked with building the headframe or winding tower of the Violet Mine just east of the Cobalt camp are said to have spotted a huge hairy man watching them from partial concealment in the trees. Word of this disturbing event spread quickly throughout the silver fields and embedded itself in local memory. We owe our knowledge of this regrettably vague report to a handful of articles published years later in the North Bay Nugget, North Bay, Ontario being the nearest city to Cobalt, located 145 kilometers or 90 miles to the south. The articles came into the possession of Canadian Sasquatch researcher Rene de Hinden, who sent them to his friend and counterpart John Green, who in turn published them in his 1971 book, On the Track of Sasquatch. 17 years after the sighting at the Violet Mine, the wildman of Cobalt made a second appearance, this time near the Wettlaufer Mine, the latter lying about 25 kilometers or 16 miles southeast of Cobalt. According to an article in the July 27, 1923 issue of the North Bay Nugget, in which the story of the 1906 sighting was published for the first time, and in the greatest detail, miners J. A. Macaulay and Lorne Wilson were working their claims northeast of the Wettlaufer Mine, presumably near the southwestern shores of Lake Temiskaming, when they noticed what they first took to be a black bear sitting in a blueberry patch, picking fruit from the bush. Wilson threw a rock at the hairy creature, prompting it to stand up on two legs and growl at him. The figure then darted into the forest and out of sight, running on two legs like a human. It sure was like no bear that I have ever seen, Wilson told reporters. Its head was kind of yellow, and the rest of it was black like a bear, all covered with hair. The newspaper described the creature as ape-like, and reported that locals had named it Yellow Top, on account of its light-colored mane. It is worth noting that this article predates the famous and sensational reports of the Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest, which began with J.W. Burns' famous article for the April 1929 issue of Maclean's magazine, precluding any influence of the latter. The yellow-headed wildman of the Canadian Shield made its third appearance in the Cobalt area in 1946, 23 years after the 1923 sighting. This time, the witnesses were a mother and son who lived at Gillies Depot, a settlement which had sprung up around a railway station and section house of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway about 7 kilometers or 4 miles southwest of Cobalt. About a half-mile east of Gillies Depot, the railroad runs along the shores of a small body of water called Gillies Lake, not to be confused with the pond of the same name, which lies at the northeastern end of Timmins, Ontario, about 164 kilometers or 100 miles to the northwest. It was at the southern edge of Gillies Lake that the sighting took place. Old Yellow Top declared a piece in the April 16, 1946 issue of the North Bay Nugget. The half-man, half-beast that is supposed to be roaming the wilds around the Cobalt mining camp was reportedly seen again, this time by a woman and her son, who lived near Gillies Depot, while they were walking the tracks into Cobalt. The woman, who did not want her name made public, said that she spotted a dark, hairy animal with a light head ambling off the tracks into the bush near Gillies Lake. She said she did not get a clear look at the thing, but said that it walked almost like a man. The article concluded with the declaration that a search party may be formed to try and find Old Yellow Top. To the best of this author's knowledge, the hopeful monster hunt never got underway. With the possible exception of a vague roadside sighting alluded to in the North Bay Nugget, the fourth and most dramatic encounter with Old Yellow Top took place one evening in the summer of 1970 on the gravel road to the Cobalt Lode Mine, about 5 kilometers or 3 miles southwest of town. That night, driver Amy Latray was conveying a busload of 27 miners consigned to the graveyard shift, repeating a commute he had made nearly every evening for the past 4 months, when a dark figure loomed from the roadside forest before him and lumbered into the glare of his high beams. At first I thought it was a big bear, Latray told a reporter, whose story was published in the August 5, 1970 issue of the Nugget. But then it turned to face the headlights, and I could see some light hair, almost down to its shoulders. It couldn't have been a bear. The tray slammed on the brakes, sending the bus into a wild fishtail, which nearly resulted in a fatal plunge off a cliff, and allowing the mysterious pedestrian an opportunity to complete its crossing and vanish into the trees on the other side of the road. When later asked to identify the creature, the tray simply stated, "I have heard of this thing before, but never believed it. Now I'm sure." He added that he was less sure whether he would continue to drive the bus to the Cobalt lode mine. The tray's account was echoed by the testimony of one of his passengers, a miner named Larry Cormack. "It looked like a bear to me at first," Cormack told a reporter, "but it didn't walk like one. It was kind of half stooped over. Maybe it was a wounded bear. I don't know." When asked whether he thought the creature might have been Old Yellowtop, which the paper alternately referred to as the Precambrian Shield Man, Cormack said, "My father used to talk about it, but I've seen it close up." The reporter ended his story with a quip that the mysterious pedestrian might have been a rowdy patron from a local saloon, which John Green took as an indication that the newspaper, at least, regarded the story as a hoax. This sentiment was confirmed by Green's associate, Bill Davis, who made inquiries at the Nugget office and learned that the journalist there regarded the tale as a miner's prank. In their 1999 book, The Field Guide to Bigfoot, Yeti, and Other Mystery Primates Worldwide, in which they separate the various legendary wild men of the world into taxonomic classes of their own devising, cryptozoologists Lauren Coleman and Patrick Weig placed Old Yellowtop into a genus they called marked hominid. In their outline of this taxonomic class, they explained that the term marked hominid has a double meaning, deriving from the Christian name of Mark A. Hall, the cryptozoologist who first identified the unique traits of the supposed wildman subclass, which he initially christened taller hominids, as well as from the Mansi word, masheni, or marked one, a local nickname for a hairy wildman from western Siberia, whose reddish-brown coat was marred by an anomalous patch of white fur covering the left forearm. Like the masheni, members of the marked hominid class are distinguished by their two-toned or multicolored hair patterns, which Old Yellowtop, with his dark coat and yellow mane, clearly displayed. It is worth noting that Old Yellowtop shares this singular attribute with the so-called traverspine gorilla, another supposed wildman, spotted at the eastern edge of the Canadian Shield, in the wilds of Labrador, which witnesses described as having a shock of white hair on the crown of its head. Other characteristics shared by members of the marked hominid subclass are their native subarctic range and roughly 7-foot-tall stature. Incredibly, Old Yellowtop is not the only mysterious creature said to lurk on the outskirts of Cobalt, Ontario. Just east of town, straddling the border of Ontario and Quebec, is a long, deep body of water called Lake Temiskaming, which legend says is home to a monster known as the mugwump. But that's a story for another time. I'm very pleased to announce that my new book, Mysteries of Canada Volume 4, is now available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook format. This book is filled with traditional Canadian folktales, which have been presented on this channel in video format throughout 2022 and 2023. The subjects it treats with include the Sasquatch, the Wendigo, the Ogopogo, the Thunderbird, and legends of Prince Edward Island. To get yourself or a friend or family member a copy of this book, please check out the link in the description.